It was a couple days ago. I was hanging out with Aunt Gay. Hey, everybody else calls her that. I can call her that too. She just had knee replacement surgery. Well, she's actually my sister, so Sister Gay. And Carol was there, and we talked about everything. I think I was there for about 2 hours, just giggling, having a good time, and we got into last week's sermon, into this week's sermon, and Carol said, "Well, I guess I don't have to come now because I already heard it." Wrong. Because I'm waiting for next week, because I want to share with you today some thoughts that have been running through my head. Thus, whenever I get the table and chair, it kind of, for me, I just want to share. I just want to talk. I want to share. It's funny because when I bring it out, it's just me with the Creighton atmosphere in the church, and even with me, not to get all guns and blazing, but right now I feel like going guns and blazes because the worship was true worship. But I want to talk about what we talked about last week. I want to take a pause before we get back into 1 Kings, where we talk about obedience is better than sacrifice. Because I really believe that a nerve was struck in the church, not in a negative way at all, but I had a lot of conversations about last week's sermon, and I think it's exciting. And the ones that I was talking to, which is interesting because it's not usually the norm. These were different folks, and I believe with all my heart that we are definitely on a journey of growth within the church. And I know for me, I am in a journey of growth, because I got to tell you, as I've been preparing for this, and as we're going into personal revival, having personal revival that spills over into a revival that will spill into the community, God has been teaching me, sharing with me, and again, even though I was the one preaching last week's sermon, it affected me. And for those that weren't here, we talked about Saul was given the orders to finally to take out the Amalekites. For years and years and years, from the time that the children of Israel left Egypt and the way they went after the children of Israel, God said there will be a day where we will wipe them out. And last week we talked about God sharing through Samuel to go and to take them out, and Saul was going to lead it. And he gave Saul specific instructions on what to do. Basically it was this: wipe everything out that breathes. Every person, doesn't matter age, every animal, everything, wipe them all out. And we learned that Saul wiped them all out, except for the king, and except for the best of the best of the livestock. And we learned that for God, 90% of obedience meant disobedience. He didn't say, well, because you obeyed 9 out of 10, I'm going to give you credit for 9 and 10% not. So basically, Saul, I still give you an A. And it's important for us to see that, is because so many times the way we see life, the way we see Christianity, the way we see right and wrong, is the way we believe God sees right and wrong, obedience and disobedience. And we learned real quick that that's not the case at all. So there was no 90%, I give you an A minus. It was disobedience. We also touched on what caused that. There's always a cause to the effect. And God knows and sees deeply the cause. And we also talked how Samuel was not happy with God because ultimately God said, look, I'm repenting of him. Not meaning that I made a mistake. I'm turning away from Saul and I'm going to move in another direction, which we later find out in the next chapter, in chapter 16, that David steps on the scene and goes to battle against the Philistines and Goliath. And so last week we talked about those things, and we talked about 5 areas that show what brings disobedience. And it also shows on the flip side, not just the disobedience, but the pleasure that God gets in obedience. And so I want to take a pause this Sunday, and I want to go, and I'm going to jump back into it next Sunday. But one of the reasons is, as I was just kind of meditating throughout the week and praying through some things and looking at some scriptures, I noticed and saw many of this main idea where sacrifice is better than obedience. And I think it's important because, as we talked a little last week, when Samuel asked Saul, why did you spare the livestock? And he said, well, number one, the men did it, but they wanted to actually take the livestock and give it as a burnt offering to God. And so that's after they said that, that's when Samuel said, well, remember that obedience is better than sacrifice. And I think I wanted to take a pause, because I think if we're not careful as a church and as the church, we will base our relationship on our responsibilities that we do for God. And for Saul, he was basing his relationship with God by saying, I did 90% of it. As a matter of fact, the 10% that he didn't do, because he saved the king and he saved the best of the livestock, when he said, look, you disobeyed God, Saul said, no, I didn't. I didn't disobey God. I did what I was asked. I saved just a few of the livestock, and I saved the king, but ultimately I did what God would do. And I saved them because I was going to do this and this and this for God. And I think that we have to be careful that we don't base relationship and responsibility in the same way, because that can become a danger. And I think that we, as a church growing on this journey that God is taking us on, need to really take a step back and really understand the depths of full commitment, full devotion, and full obedience. Because we can say that we're fully devoted to Christ. It's something that we like to say. But if we're not getting our marching orders from God and saying, God, whatever that you will have of me, and then make sure that we fulfill those things to the nth degree, not just giving God mostly obedience or sacrificing to Him through our service by the things that we want to do and really not the things that God wants us to do, or whatever major decisions going on, or even our lifestyle. If we're not going to Him constantly and saying, God, I want to be obedient to you. I don't want to just give you sacrifice or service. I want to give you what you require and desire. And as I was kind of going through this week, it took me back to Genesis. It took me back to where sin began, with God giving some requirements and Adam and Eve falling off the wagon and taking of the fruit. Even though everything else was great, they still took of the fruit. And then asking the question, well, even though it was just this one moment, this one day, and it took a serpent. It took a serpent to coax them on in. What was going on in the heart of Adam and Eve that allowed those things to happen. Again, the dangers of thinking that the responsibilities that we do for God, or the services that we do for God, shows, and it's okay that it shows my relationship with God is good. So I'm thinking about Adam and Eve, and I'm thinking about Cain and Abel. And I'm reading, and I think it's Genesis 5. Genesis 5, it talks about Cain and Abel, maybe 4 or 5. And both brothers are to bring sacrifices to God. And we know that Abel brought livestock to be burned because of the blood sacrifice. And we know that Abel brought his best fruit, his best crops, vegetables. And God received Abel's sacrifice and rejected Cain's sacrifice. And looking at Cain, he brought his best. But we're not sure exactly what God required, because it doesn't say, but it does say what he received and what he rejected. So obviously, if he received Abel's sacrifice, and we know that he carried along for, 2,000 years or 1,000 years or longer, blood sacrifice, that's probably what he was requiring. But yet Cain said, look, I want to give God my best. Even though he said something else, I'm still going to give him what I want to give him. And it was utterly, utterly wrong. And God said, I reject it, and was not happy. But we also read that it was rejected, and Cain could have done two different things. He could have said,